Hey reader, welcome back to the channel. This is Centaur here, and today we are taking a look at the various elements of a heavy weapons platoon and looking at the platoon as a whole and asking the question, is it any good? Right? Now that we have, 6 different platoons that we're looking at for third edition, there's a legitimate question of you don't necessarily and probably shouldn't be taking all of them in a given force. And so which ones are really great and which ones are not. And unsurprising to a lot of people who play on the competitive side of things, but also hopefully reassuring to people who are more historically minded, the heavy weapons platoon is great. Okay. It is not an all purpose, fixes every single problem. Absolutely. You have to have one in order to win sort of platoons, but it does have a lot of very useful tools in it. And so it's not surprising that people who want to perform really well in bolt action often will take these. It is not strictly necessary. I just came back this past weekend, if I can find it, from the V3 for Victory tournament, and I took first place there without a heavy weapons platoon. But unsurprisingly, this platoon still performs really well, and a lot of people who win tournaments often have them. And so we'll go into some of the strengths and weaknesses that are present in it. Suffice it to say, first of all, shout out to my Polish medium mortar team right over there to the right, which was one of the first support teams I ever bought. This is the Warlord model, of course, that you can find on their website. Still really great kit, and the faces are particularly excellent on this particular one. Very, very flavorful and emotive, which is excellent. But we're going to be looking at scenarios, how strong this is for helping you win the common scenarios that we tend to see in third edition. We're going to be looking at board considerations, deployment considerations, what kinds of matchups a heavy weapons platoon gets excited about, the kinds of armies that they tend to see, and which ones maybe they're a little more fearful about because it might antiquate them. Effective choices, what kinds of things you should be looking at when you're actually choosing your heavy weapons platoon. We'll look at nation considerations. So specific nations might have options that make them stronger or worse, and thus might play a factor into what you're looking at. And then finally, we're just going to end with why this is important, right? Like what the final answer on why you should consider taking these. And so to start off with, from a kill point counting perspective, if that's all that's scoring for you, it's fine. It's not great because they tend to be comprised of squads of 2 to 4 people, maybe 5 for the officers section, and that assumes that you have an army book. Every now and then you might end up with larger groups, but in general, it's about 2 to 4 people, which is relatively easy to remove. Admittedly, though, the flip side of this and why I'm not just considering it bad is that one, these are typically the kinds of units where if they're coming under fire and you're afraid you're going to lose a unit and thus cough up points for the scenario, you could probably just go down with them. And then try to keep them alive a little bit longer and let other units do their job. Because the nice thing about this, as you'll see as a constant theme, is that it's relatively cheap firepower. And so because of that, one turn of them not shooting or not doing, the job of trying to remove the enemy is probably not going to sink your army the same way that, say, like a heavy tank or even an infantry section might. In terms of objective controlling, these are actually pretty good because you can typically deploy them on an objective or quickly move them onto an objective. And then they can typically hang out there just, doing the hard work of maintaining the objective, defending the objective, if necessary, even just going down if it's not being pushed, but, the enemy's just trying to put some supporting fire on it. And in some cases, especially in the case of anti-tank teams, they might even be useful in helping you to clear other objectives and continue to move up. So, in general, objective controlling, they're actually pretty good. They're a relatively cheap way to make sure that an objective stays under your control. From a maneuver and positioning perspective, they're fine. Some elements of the heavy weapons platoon maneuver really well. Obviously, things like this Alpini machine gun team and more, the larger mortar teams, they don't maneuver quite as well. That being said, there might be some situations where, being able to move up a machine gun team or even pull it in from outflank or something else like that could make them quite an effective piece for moving up and taking far-flung objectives. Okay. And so because of that, it's really not bad, but it is very heavily nation dependent, right? It is also very heavily dependent on what the rest of your army composition is, right? Like if you don't have a lot of really good units that are pushing up, let's say that you skimped on your infantry sections and you took a bunch of like inexperienced shirker units to save points. You might actually be better trying to clear an objective with, say, a bunch of armored vehicles, clear out a bunch of enemies, and then move up a machine gun team than you are moving up a shirker unit, right? It all depends, right? How much cover is there? How much open ground do you need to cover? how many men are still left in a given unit, you might find it's better to move up a heavy machine gun team or a machine gun team because they might still be sitting at 3 or 4 men, and that might actually be a better option than what you're looking at elsewhere. So it all depends. Obviously, some nations' anti-tank options are going to be better or worse than others. Some of them are going to have better mortar options. Not every nation, for example, has access to heavy mortars. There's even one nation from last edition that didn't have access to light mortars. They only had the medium. So it all depends, right? Different things are present for different armies. A very small number of armies, like only 3 armies that are immediately coming to mind, have heavy machine guns on infantry teams, right? And so because of that, like, it really all depends on what your options are, but that's going to very much determine how effective they might be at some of these scenario types. Now, when you look at board considerations, in general, heavy weapons platoons want about a medium density amount of cover. They don't want a light amount of cover because while that does help to provide nice long ranges of fire, it allows your indirect fire units to have lots of line of sight. It also generally means less cover for them. And again, 2 to 4 man units. So you got to be really careful on that. At the same time, you don't want really heavy density cover either because you need those longer reaches of fire. Now, there are exceptions to this. If you're just running Piat teams with a 12-inch range, you might actually really love just really dense urban combat Stalingrad with ruins, right? So that, you got lots of line of sight blocking and stuff like that. Or you just pop out, shoot at stuff, and then the next turn you run over toward the next building, then you pop out and shoot at stuff on the following turn, right? Like that is advantageous, and there is definitely an advantage to that. I think in general, medium density is more accurate for what people actually tend to like with this platoon. You do need the protection. You also need the firing lane, so you kind of need that balance. In general, you want a lot of these units to be in hard cover deployment. Okay, things like that partisan anti-tank rifle team, for example, over there on the right-hand side, is going to want to be in something like a ruin that'll give it a 4+ save because, again, 2 men, probably taking it somewhere around regular, that's not a lot of durability, and the hard cover is going to help. But you still also want those firing lanes. So in general, placing them behind a stone wall, placing them in a ruin, those are kind of the ideal spots, okay, of where you want them. And then finally, in as much as you're using things like anti-tank teams, for example, having access to roads is very important because you very well might want to be able to transport those guys up and move them very quickly from one place to another, okay? Especially with those shorter range anti-tank stuff. So the AT rifle on the right-hand side doesn't matter quite as much because, you can put them in a transport, you can keep them further back and provide supporting fire. They work either way. Things like bazookas, Panzerschrecks, even more so Piats, which have half the range of the other two, they're really going to want to transport. And to some extent, units that are using, lunge mines or AT grenades or things like that, they really might want to transport, right? They can't assault coming straight out of the transport, but they'll probably want to have a faster way of crossing the board that doesn't require them to just go running at 12 inches, possibly 6 inches if they have to run through rough terrain. From a deployment consideration, in general, and this might be controversial, but that's okay. Leave your thoughts down below if you disagree. I think deploy your machine guns first. Like literally the first deployment dice you have, put down a machine gun team if you brought one. And there's a couple of reasons for this. First of all, you're going to want clean lanes for something like a machine gun team. And let's just be real. There are only so many of those that are going to be advantageous for you for covering actual lines that an enemy is going to have to move on a given board. So let's be real. Yes, there's an advantage of like, ooh, if I hold it back, they won't know exactly where I'm going. But your opponent has a rough idea of where they're going. And there's a lot more important stuff like troops in a transport and stuff like that you really want to hide a lot longer, right? You want to hide some of your more important armored units longer so that way they can't counter deploy their anti-tank options effectively. The machine gun team, it's already going to be in mortar trouble. You already know that. It needs to have a clear line of fire. You want to make sure that your allied units are not, kind of constraining that line of fire because you can't fire within an inch of an allied unit. So you're really, really going to want to make sure that you put it down early on so that you know what to work around. Furthermore, I understand that there's a strategy and I don't have a problem with it. It's totally legal, totally fine, and highly advised that the first order dice you receive for deploying units should go to units that are held in reserve, held in outflank, or are in a transport because they aren't going to be deploying anyway. That is perfectly reasonable. I proffer to you as somebody who wins a decent amount, I tend to win more games than I lose at any given event, or I win or draw more than I lose at any given event. Um, there's a certain level of sportsmanship that comes from saying, yes, I have 7 units that I could just put down and watch you put out half your army by the time I'm putting down anything of substance. But I'm going to tell you where part of my army is so that you can plan something around it. And yes, I might lose that unit because you were able to put a nice counter around it, and that's fine. And so looking at my army list, I choose a machine gun team because it is helpful, it is useful, but if I lose it, I'm not crying. Right. And so, from a sportsmanship perspective, not an optimized winning perspective, but from a sportsmanship perspective, may I present to you, and especially to the more advanced, more veteran players out there, put down a machine gun team first, then do all of the reserve stuff. Okay. I feel like it will grow the community better. And we on this channel, just in case there's any confusion about this, we are a math channel. We want to help optimize the things you want to play, but we are not strictly a competitive channel. We're an optimizer channel that is not strictly competitive. I will work with whatever you want. More on that in the So You Want to Play series coming out next year. Okay. But suffice it to say for now, is this the most optimal play? Probably not. We think it's optimized for building your gaming community, and that is optimal. So I'm recommending it here. You can do with it what you want. Okay. Maybe you're at if you're at the Worlds and you really want your team to win and your team tells you do what you have to do to win, disregard this advice. Fair enough. But for literally everybody else, but especially for casual play, just put down a thing so that people can work around it. I just think it's a good idea. Okay. Next thing, plan your road access for transported anti-tank teams, right? If you put an anti-tank team in a transport, there's a very good chance that it has a 24-inch range or lower, and you want to make sure that you're able to optimize that range. One of the best ways to optimize it is to get to point-blank range as quickly as possible, because that way, at the very least, you're probably hitting on something like 3s. It could be 4s, because it could be that you took pins and then you moved, and so even though you're point-blank range, you're still hitting on 4s. But your chances of hitting are pretty high, which means your chances of getting value out of that unit are really high. Even something like a Piat, the much maligned Piat, can be quite efficient for its points, highly efficient for its points, if it's firing at point blank range. And so because of that, if you have a road, it just means that whatever your transport is, as long as it's half-tracked or wheeled, it's going to be way better at getting you to point blank range of the enemy, because it's going to have an 18 to 24-inch advance that can then be followed with a 6-inch drop, right? 6-inch move out, and then you fire, right? And that means you can get to halfway through the table being at point blank range of you, as long as you got nice straight shots with roads, which a lot of roads are pretty straight, okay? So in general, plan your road access for your AT teams, okay? From a mortars question, there's a lot to be said about how to pick your mortar. Okay, and we're going to be talking about this a little bit in the So You Want to Play series, okay? But suffice it to say for now, the first question you should probably ask is, what veterancy do I want to take this thing at? I would even ask that question before you look at whether you want to take a light, medium, or heavy mortar, okay? First things first, what veterancy do you want to take this at? Because if you want to take it inexperienced because it's cheap, you plan to just keep it in the back, you plan to keep it safe behind some cover, and you'll have way more important things that people will be shooting at than your little light mortar team or your medium mortar team or your heavy mortar team that's inexperienced. In as much as that's the case, you may not need to take a really big mortar if you're just looking at taking something inexperienced, because one of the benefits of taking a big mortar is that you can take spotters, but you can't use the spotter if you're taking an inexperienced mortar, right? So if you're already looking inexperienced, that kind of opens up the options, but it also can allow you to cut some out very quickly, depending on what it is that you want, right? Related to that, do you want spotters? Some boards are going to be pretty dense. It's going to be really hard to get good lines of fire. It'd be pretty easy to get away from your mortars. They won't do very much for you if you don't take a spotter. But if you do take a spotter, if you want to use a spotter, you got to take them regular or veteran. So now you're looking at, a much greater expense, easily over 50, possibly even up to 75 points for a mortar. So that's a critical question. I think the big thing you want to keep in mind is, regardless of what you take, heavy cover is what you want for these, okay? You can technically get away with a lower level of cover for some other units. Machine gun teams, for example, you could place in soft cover because you could always just choose to go down, right? It is nice to have. They're going to produce pins. They might even do some wounds, but they're not strictly necessary to win most games. So you could put them in soft cover, go down if they come under fire, and do a 3+ save, which is great. Mortars, if they go down, they reset whatever it is they were working on, which means the effectiveness of your mortar is going to go down dramatically. So in an ideal world, what you would prefer is a morale bubble from an officer nearby, more on that next, and a unit that can just declare a fire order every single turn. That's what you want. And that means shrugging off wounds and working around pins because of the morale bubble. Okay. And especially if you're taking these things inexperienced, may I recommend a 4+ save after the opponent wounded on 3s will save you a lot of headache and a lot of trouble. Okay. In general, I tend to lean toward medium or heavy mortars. I made it very clear in one of the earlier videos on this channel that I don't like light mortars, basically at all. Other people love light mortars. They find them to be very good. I don't disagree with those people. I'm sure that they're really good at using them. I am not very good at using them. I find that it uses way too much micro and too much of my brain power to do it. And especially if I've got multiple games going on in the same day, I don't want to waste that in round 1 and round 2 just trying to micro light mortars when I could use something else that'll be probably just as effective at removing tools. So I don't tend to use them. Other people do use them to taste. If you like them, go ahead and use them. I tend to lean medium or heavy, but obviously there's only like 6 or 7 nations that can take heavy mortars. So yeah, it's a little more limited there. The platoon commander is actually a really interesting question. And as I mentioned in last week's video, it actually kind of delayed the release of this video because I realized that me talking about, cheap morale bubble officers compared to supporting fire officers or small assault unit officers, that I needed to define all those terms. And the script was growing to be like really long, like even Centaur really long, right? By comparison to my other videos. And so because of that, I had to do that video first. But, referencing that video, very commonly, the cheap morale bubble officer is the one you use. And the reason why you tend to use that one is because all you need for these kinds of units, since a lot of them are fixed in the heavy weapons platoon, you just need somebody who can hang out with a bunch of these mortars, machine gun teams, sometimes even anti-tank options in the case of things like the Umpalament launcher and the Blacker Bombard. These are units that want to sit back. They don't really want to be moving. So you can just park an officer out of line of sight behind a ruin or, behind a building or behind a forest, but he's still within range of the rest of your mortars and machine gun teams or whatever. And he's just making sure that they activate more reliably, right? That's his job. You could, and this is especially common with things like the Americans and the Finns, where you're getting benefits to using things like rifles. You could get away with a small squad, 2-3 men, something like that if you wanted to, that all have rifles. And they're just a supporting fire squad. They're right there alongside a number of these, especially mortar and machine gun teams, and the mortar teams perhaps even more specifically, since mortars have a minimum range, where they're just sitting back there to pin people, maybe even do some removal. Who cares? Who knows? Maybe you're putting that guy on ambush so he can then snap 2 and then give his orders to other stuff. Ambush is nice for officers because it means you can always change it to down if you want to. But it also means that you can interrupt somebody else's move and shoot at them when they're not in cover. So you might actually get some removal out of that unit. That can be a very effective tool too for, again, helping to protect your stationary fixed assets, while at the same time also allowing you to pretty effectively support the work that's going on, right? You're providing support in the form of the morale bubble, but you're also providing support in terms of pin generation and possibly even removal. The small assault units can be nice because, maybe the rest of your army is very assault heavy and you're like, okay, I want to take multiple transports with assault units in them. I'm going to take a heavy weapons platoon, because then I could take 2 inexperienced light mortars or 2, inexperienced machine gun teams. So it's a relatively cheap tax, but that allows me to then take a pretty nice additional assault unit officer so I can continue doing the snap 2s and the morale bubbles where I need to be moving up and pushing, right? And so you have the space there, especially if they're going to be escorting other anti-tank options, right? So one of the things that I will pretty commonly do is put an officer along with a 2-man anti-tank team in a 3 or 4-man transport, right? Something super cheap, super utility, super tactical that we talked about in the transport series. But at the same time, the heavy weapons platoon provides me with another really nice, tiny way to be able to do it, and with a relatively minimal tax, which is great. And part of the reason why heavy weapons platoons are so good, because of the fact that the units are so cheap. From a matchups consideration, if you find that you're hitting an armored force, they're running a lot of armor, 1 to 2 platoons of armor, this is a very iffy choice. Ironically, if you hit 3 armor platoons, you actually might be doing better, with these because those tend to be extremely light, right? Like we're talking DV6, DV7 vehicles. They might have a machine gun, right? A whole swarm of French battle snails, right? The Renault FT-17 that's slow, pitifully slow with just a little machine gun. You could build 3 rifle platoons and 3 armored platoons and run a ton of those if you really wanted to, and have your only heavy weapons be like AT rifles and light mortars in your rifle platoons if you wanted to. Maybe VB launchers, but I would not personally recommend VB launchers for the same reason I don't recommend light mortars. I just don't like them. But if you're hitting substantial armor, like they put 60% or more of their armor and they're not doing really, really cheap, flimsy stuff, you will find that while you technically have pretty good firepower in this, easily up to pen plus, 2, 4, 5, 6 on your anti-tank teams, they're really fragile. So it really depends, like who gets the first drop, right? Your anti-tank options, if they can get the first drop, they might do okay. Can your mortars range in on these armored vehicles? Then you might do okay. Do you have heavy machine gun teams, right? Like, the Belgians, the United States, the Soviets, right? If you have HMGs, you will be able to, pin these things down. And in the case of DV6, armored platoon heavy armies, you might even do removal with those, right? So like it all depends. I think it's a waffly one. I'm not entirely sure whether it's a good choice or not. You might find that it all collapses and it doesn't actually work. Against assault armies, I think they're a pretty bad choice, actually. First of all, because things like mortars hate assault-oriented armies because they're going to be in their minimum range. They're going to force them to be constantly redeploying, and that's not a good use of your mortar. Things like anti-tank teams tend to not do very well against assault armies because the transports tend to be snapped. They tend to move. They tend to suddenly deploy all of their guys, and then oh, you got the transport. Yay. Go you. But it doesn't matter anymore because now they're going to clean up all of your stuff, including that anti-tank team, right? So, like, it all depends. Machine gun teams, of course, have the classic problem of do you have really good lines of fire and can you preempt where that assaulting unit is going to come from? Assault armies, especially assault armies that make use of outflank, can be very, very tricky for things like machine gun teams. So, there really is not a very good tool in the heavy weapons platoon for dealing with assault, which is historically accurate because they were not generally utilized in that way, right? Like they weren't deployed on their own, right? The machine guns obviously did sometimes, they did really good work against assaults in World War I, but by the time of World War II, you have a lot of shelling, you have a lot of other stuff going on, and then when people start moving up, heavy weapons, elements were relying on the rifle platoon and their own armor to help to protect them, right? So as a platoon, it's not very good. Your total army composition using this platoon might be great, okay? But the actual platoon elements themselves, these are not the tools you want for dealing with an assault army as a general rule, okay? Against flamethrower and barbecue armies, very similarly, pretty bad choice. Mortars really, really don't like it when people get in close. They really don't like it when they're incentivized to get within 6 inches, right? Anti-tank teams sometimes work well against engineering style units and engineering transports. Sometimes they don't. Does the machine gun team get its line of fire? An excellent question, right? Greatest hit / mixed bag armies, these are actually really great. And that's mostly because while mixed bag armies tend to have a variety of threats, the heavy weapons platoon has a variety of tools, right? You have direct fire and indirect fire tools. You have high penetration and small arms tools. You have cheap options. You have more expensive options that give you higher quality, right? Like you tend to have a lot of variance within this. And because of that, you can typically take a lot of the tools you would need to deal with a mixed bag greatest hit style army with a heavy weapons platoon. And then the rest of your army can do whatever the heck it wants. Gunline armies, these are great, mostly because things like machine gun teams and mortar teams, they love doing counter battery fire. They love locking down lines. Gunline armies tend to want to have nice long ranges to shoot at. Heavy weapons platoons can take advantage of those exact same ranges, but for an awful lot cheaper, doing comparable, if not more damage. And so because of that, pretty effective. Horde armies, these are also really great. Heavy weapons platoon provides a lot of pin potential between splash damage and high explosive damage coming from your HE, from the mortars, between machine guns, potentially being able to reliably put pins down, especially on inexperienced hordes, but also pretty reliably remove a couple of guys down and actually thin the herd. Anti-tank options against infantry hordes are not that great, But all of the AT options in your heavy weapons platoon, regardless of nation, are great against armor hordes because armor hordes tend to be DV6, DV7. They tend to have very minimal weaponry, one machine gun, maybe two, or it's like Bren carriers, maybe with like an AT rifle, right? Or something like that on it. All of which an AT team can be pretty survivable against because you're talking about 1 to 3 shots coming out from the vehicle. And so because of that, chance you remove them versus they remove you is actually probably in favor of the infantry section, which is kind of a cool place to be. Against mechanized armies, I think it's pretty iffy, right? I mean, it comes down really to, can you get the drop on the transports? Can your anti-tank and machine gun teams actually handle the transports to slow down the advance? Are you able to get your lines of fire? What's the order die discrepancy, right? If you have a small number of order dice and they have a large number of order dice, they might be able to move up, jump out a bunch of men, and clear out a bunch of your tools before you have a chance to deal with them, which could be really bad and could make the mechanized unit quite effective and possibly even win the game very early on. By the end of turn 2 or turn 3, the game could be over. And it's not surprising right now that mechanized armies are one of the strongest builds right now in the competitive meta. For mortar heavy armies, this is a great choice because mostly it's a mirror match, right? I mean, you're using mortars, they're using mortars against each other. It's just going to be a question of whose mortars are going to be more effective. If you're using a machine gun team like that Chindit team over there on the right-hand side, you might even be able to do better against the mortars because if they took them in experience, that machine gun team might be able to work them down while the other mortars are trying to range in, which means maybe the enemy misses for a turn. Maybe they fail an order test, they go down, which resets them back to 6s if they were ranging in. All of that is really good news, right? And so for people who are running, whether it's the light mortar swarm or the heavy mortar swarm or something like that, you might find that it can be pretty effective to just run a heavy weapons platoon with a lot of different options. And then finally, for skirmish armies, I mean, again, it's a pretty iffy choice, right? How mobile is the enemy and how well are you able to deal with those, especially the machine gun teams, which are the most likely to handle them. Mortars are going to hurt going against a skirmish army. That being said, skirmish armies that are especially relying on transports to help with some of that skirmishing and staying at range, if they're using upgunned transports that have lots of machine guns, so they don't really want to close too quickly, they want to be able to take advantage of those shots, you might find that your AT teams are actually quite effective at helping to stunt them down. Or they might get just lit up before they can ever reach anybody and get in range. It all depends on how all that goes. And so I don't know that I can call that one way or the other. From a choice consideration, there are roughly 4 different types of stuff other than obviously you got to choose what style of officer you want to use. You've got your machine guns. In general, you want this to be taken regular, okay? Because they make for really good supporting fire units done that way. Or you can take them veteran. This generally tends to give you access to useful subtypes. So for example, if you want fieldcraft, pretty much you have to go with veteran in order to get fieldcraft in this edition, okay? At least for these types of supporting teams. Now, it is worth noting, inexperienced machine gun teams are still good if all you're trying to do is pins, okay? Because if you're firing 6 shots, and you're starting on 4s, goes to 5s, goes to 6s if you are pinned or you're missing a lot of guys, you're likely to get at least 1 6, right? It doesn't always happen. So keep in mind, I'm not saying you're guaranteed to get a pin per turn, but you're pretty likely to get a pin per turn. And so if all you're looking to purchase a machine gun team for is its pin generation, then you could hypothetically just take all of your machine gun teams and experience, and that makes it a whole lot cheaper in terms of going that route. As somebody who has, in one casual game just to test things with a friend of mine, run 15 inexperienced American machine guns, I can tell you for a fact that they work. Okay. However, in general, if you're looking for a supporting fire unit and you want it to activate reliably, you don't want it to be easily removed, you think that potentially order die removal might be a victory condition in a game that you're playing, you might consider taking them regular if you just mean for them to sit back, or veteran if you want to give them the ability to push up, okay? There are armies that have access to heavy machine guns. These have the exact same number of shots at 6. They get +1 to their penetration. They got 48-inch range instead of 36. There aren't very many armies that get them. Armies like Belgium, the United States, the USSR get access to these. However, may I recommend take them regular, don't take them veteran. Okay. And the simple reason for this is they're already like 70 points at regular, which is very expensive. And I really don't think it's adding that much value to you to take it veteran. Okay. Put an officer nearby, you're going to be just fine for pretty much everything you need. From a mortar's perspective, you can take them inexperienced. It just means you have to protect them. Okay. They still work just fine. I've seen a lot of people do very well, even win tournaments taking inexperienced mortars of various sizes. So because of that, they still do work. Like they, maybe not quite as well as in last edition. Last edition, because of the fact that cover was a hit modifier, there was a lot of chance people just straight missed you. So you didn't even take pins. This edition, the morale rate tends to come up a whole lot more as people start pinning you. It just means keep an officer near them and you'll be okay. Keep them in heavy cover and you'll be okay. Okay. You can definitely take them regular. If you want to use spotters, this is probably the best way to do it. You can also take them veteran. This does make them more survivable, which is good. It also tends to make them more reliable. They're less likely to fail an order test and thus have to reset their ranging in. However, I tend to find that you can typically pass on this because the points increase is typically around 15 points to increase them to regular, from regular over to veteran. And if that's the case, you could almost for the same cost buy yourself an inexperienced officer with a pistol, and you'll get most of the benefits, possibly even better benefits, just by doing that. And it'll affect all of your mortars instead of 15 points for every single one of them that you want to make veteran. So personally, I would skip on the veteran, but if for theme you want to do it, that's fine. There are still reasons to do it. For your anti-tank teams, honestly, I'd basically always run these guys regular, right? Like there is an argument, for example, for the veteran bazooka team taking the Rangers lead the way special rule, or taking a maybe even like a veteran, call it like anti-tank rifle team that's taking like the Geber's Jaeger rule or something like that. There are reasons for doing this. I personally don't think taking a veteran anti-tank team is a very good idea. It does make them more survivable. They do tend to live longer in close combat. They do tend to live longer when being shot at by the enemy. I don't tend to find it's much longer. And if I'm going to spend sometimes over 25%, but close to 30 or even 50% more points in order to take them at that level, I think I'd rather not, personally. So regular is great, especially if they're performing that long range fire support in the case of things like AT rifles. Okay. But for the shape charge weapons, close range assault units, like I can see the argument for veteran. I personally still tend to do regular. And my plan is just to prepare the way for them before I drop them in. So that way enemies will be removed or pinned down or mitigated to the point where when I drop the AT teams in, we're going to be pretty effective. And then by removing a lot of dice, we increase the chance that we get the first drop, and thus we can continue working down the other units until the AT teams can get safe. Okay. From a transports perspective, I mean, the biggest question that you have, and this is going to be slightly nation dependent because some nations don't have access to this, is do you want armored versus unarmored transports for these guys? Okay. If you're taking an armored transport, you're probably going to be using it to move stuff up pretty close to the enemy. And so you're worried about it being shot at. If that's the case, I mean, it's going to be more expensive. So you got to make plans, right? I mean, so be prepared. You're going to have, typically an officer in an AT team. That's kind of the cheapest way to be able to do this. You could, however, put machine gun teams into a transport. And, you roll the transport up on turn one, they jump out on turn one. Let's be honest, it's not like you're missing that many more shots than you would have taken all game anyway, but it might give you more advantageous shots. You might even be able to work around some of the enemy cover that they already have, which could be very, very good for your machine gun team's effectiveness. From a nation's consideration, there are a couple of things we need to think about. The first thing is your mortar access, because not all nations are created equal when it comes to mortars. Medium mortars are always good, and good news, basically everybody gets them, which is awesome. Okay. Light mortars, if you like them, you can run them. Nothing wrong with that. Okay. Heavy mortars is pretty well restricted, right? I mean, you're looking at like Britain, Germany, Finland, Hungary, Japan, the United States, and the Soviet Union. That's basically it, right? And so because of that, like, you can take heavy mortars, as we discussed in the heavy mortar video. I think you'd still be doing just fine in a lot of situations taking a medium mortar. There are some situations where a heavy mortar is more effective, so things to think about. But if you're one of those nations that doesn't get access to heavy mortars, don't worry. It's not like you're gimped and your chances of winning a match are dramatically lower, because a medium mortar is still perfectly serviceable. From a subtypes perspective, many of these options do benefit from things like fieldcraft. Okay, it's worth noting that not all of them do. Okay, not every heavy weapons team is going to get access to that, but a lot of them do. Some of them also get access to starting the game in ambush, which is really nice. Some of them get benefits to help with pin removal. We've seen this most recently with Japanese, but we also saw this with the British with the guards subtype. And some of them even get access to free movement before turn 1. Part of what makes American veteran machine gun teams, bazooka teams really good is the fact that you can take Rangers lead the way on them, and you can start them deployed looking pretty open. The opponent thinks, aha, here will be an easy dice for me to try to remove early. And then Rangers lead the way, and they move to a place that has nice cover, and they're well set up with a new line and angle of fire that helps to protect them, keep them safe. It's all shenanigans, but it's pretty cool shenanigans, and so we're big fans of that. Your anti-tank options, obviously, some are going to get more, okay? So, Japan and the United States actually get, they're going to be pretty limited, okay? Their infantry anti-tank is going to give them pretty high penetration. Some nations are not going to get very high penetration, though, out of theirs. Things like Greece and Romania, I'm pretty sure they're limited exclusively to AT rifle teams. Norway doesn't have any anti-tank infantry teams at all, okay? They're purely relying on light howitzers, medium mortars, and anti-tank grenades on veteran units, veteran infantry squads only as their AT. So keep in mind, some nations, they're going to be pretty strapped, okay? And some armies are going to have just dozens of options, right? Soviet Union has like, one for every month of the year sort of AT options, right? And some nations, again, like Greece and Romania, they're only going to get access to one. Nations like, I think it might be Romania. They, I think, only get access to the Panzerschreck. I can't remember. I feel like it's just the Panzerschreck. One of those minor Axis nations that I haven't collected yet, but I've been looking at. I feel like it's just the Shrek. So that's an expensive one. It is powerful, sure, but it is expensive. We talked about them in the Panzerschreck video. Again, I feel like there's, some have really good value, and you should definitely be running AT teams. Some nations, not so much. If you're passing on them, I think AT rifle teams are always good. Some people don't like them. Shout out to Ian, who routinely reminds us that he doesn't like them. Fair enough. If they don't work for you, I'm sorry. But just know this one's going to be to taste, right? Maybe you include them, maybe you don't. Your nation's going to help to determine part of that. Some machine gun teams in heavy weapons platoons can take pintle mounts. Okay, Germany and the USSR can both take a pintle mount for like 5 points only. It's only 5 more points. And it gives them flak on those machine gun teams, which is a really nice niche to cover, because you're pretty much only looking at that coverage in the artillery platoon, some heavy weapons platoons, like we just talked about, and the armor platoon. Those are the only 3. So I think that's pretty cool, pretty spicy. And then finally, a super niche nation consideration. The United States can take heavy weapon rifle sections, which means if you run a heavy weapons platoon, you can take small, like 3-man squads of guys that are filling those mandatory core requirements. So if you wanted a really, really cheap platoon for cheap order dice, you could technically take a 20-point inexperienced officer with a pistol, leading a 30-point regular heavy weapons rifle section, a 30-point regular heavy weapons rifle section, and then potentially repeat that like, 6 more times? 3 more machine gun teams and 3 more mortar teams? Like, you could have a lot of squads for 200 points, 9 squads for 200 points. That's crazy. That's crazy. So, just things to think about that are technically options for different armies based on the fact that you get access to a heavy weapons platoon, right? You can't do this with any other platoon in the game. And then, oh, hold on, there it is. And so finally, to answer the question, like, why does all of this matter, right? Why am I saying that this thing is good when it clearly has some drawbacks, right? We talked about units are kind of flimsy. Sometimes, there are certain styles of armies that can get past them. So why should you be taking this? First and foremost, if you're running an all infantry army, this is going to be some much needed punch. Rifle sections do have access to AT teams. They do have access to light mortars. That is extremely limited amount of anti-tank. It's extremely limited amount of high explosive damage. Heavy weapons platoon doubles down on that and allows you to get serious volume, which you are going to need because you are going to lose men in droves, okay? It is a very flexible list of units, right? Again, as we were talking about earlier, like you get a direct and indirect fire units, which not every platoon does. You get small arms and heavy weapons options, which is really nice, depending on what you're facing. You get shape charged weapons. You get HE weapons. You get weapons that have a very long range, but do still suffer that penetration of -1 on their weapons. You get a wide variety of stuff. So whatever your needs are, there's a non-zero chance you can fill it with tools from a heavy weapons platoon, and for dramatically cheaper than taking an armored platoon, which is where we'll be moving within the next few weeks. It's also a relatively cheap order dice pool, right? I mean, most of the units can be purchased for 50 points or less. And they got pretty cool weapons, right? I mean, the lowly mortar, right? The lowly 81 millimeter mortar is a tube affixed to a tripod, right? And the tube is part of the tripod setup. It is the third pod, right? And yet, I mean, it's pretty awesome, right? I mean, it's a grenade launcher lobbing things hundreds of yards away. These things are pretty awesome, right? And so, like if you want to have really cool stuff, if you want to be able to diorama a little bit with your army while you're making stuff, even more so than you can on like a 25 millimeter base, like they give you options for this in the heavy weapons platoon in ways that are really cool and really nice, similar to what we talked about with the artillery platoon. Also, just very commonly from a historical note, they very commonly accompanied rifle platoons. Okay, because again, they're relatively cheap to produce, right? I mean, making a tube and a little bipod to attach to it is super cheap. Grenades that go inside of these things are super cheap. Machine gun belt ammunition is relatively cheap to make, relatively easy to make. Machine guns are relatively easy to make, right? Even things like a bazooka or a Panzerschreck, some of the larger AT options are pretty easy to make. And so because of that, traditionally, a lot of these were fielded by a lot of armies. And so I think it's cool when we get to see them pop up. If you're a newer player and you're buying a starter army and you're like, oh, should I build the heavy weapons platoon options in here? Personally, I think the answer is yes. I would if I were you, because I think it's cheap firepower. It'll do the job. It'll service a lot of different options, a lot of variables for you. And if nothing else, by using them, you start learning how they work and how they play, what they're vulnerable to, what they're strong against. And that's going to help you when you play against them, even if you end up going to an event like I recently did where I didn't run one. But what do you think? Do you think the heavy weapons platoon is just too soft, too squishy to be viable in a meta that's primarily being dominated by armor and machine guns? Do you think that this is one of those like go-to auto-include platoons that like you grab your rifle platoon, the next thing you fill out is your heavy weapons platoon because it's just that good? Let us know down in the comments below, and I will see you next time.